Never trust a gold business card with no name. Emma was just a broke diner waitress who stumbled onto a multimillionaire bleeding out in the rain. Instead of an ID, she finds a glowing card that summons a private mafia army in exactly 3 minutes. But the real shock comes when the city's most feared crime boss looks her directly in the eye and says, "My son is alive because you made the right call." That is not something I forget. Here's how her quiet life ended instantly.
We must approach this clinical file without prejudice. You and I are about to examine the psychological collapse of a woman named Emma. Observe her standing beneath the failing street lamp, holding a phone to her ear while a man bleeds onto the concrete. The entity on the other end of the line exhibits the classic flat effect of a sociopath, demanding she stay put and avoid the police. The self-preservation instinct should trigger flight. A rational subject walks away. The lesson here is brutal but necessary for survival. Sometimes true safety requires turning a blind eye to the suffering of others. Instead, Emma overrides her own defense mechanisms, stepping directly into the psychological web of a megalomaniac. From a behavioral standpoint, Emma had successfully conditioned herself against environmental hazards. Working late shifts at a diner instilled a hypervigilance, teaching her to identify predatory traps in the dark. She understood the critical lesson that preserving one's mental boundaries is mandatory, as the world will exploit any vulnerability. Yet, human empathy can be a dangerous neurological flaw. I mean, look at the male subject, Ethan, bleeding on the asphalt and reaching out. That single, pathetic gesture dismantles her conditioned boundaries. Her strict survival rule dissolves into the freezing mist. She is making a textbook error, trading her own biological safety for an irrational compulsion to rescue a dying stranger. As an analyst, I look for the visual triggers that alter a subject's behavior. Here, it is the fabric of Ethan's suit, signaling high-tier wealth completely out of place in this impoverished sector. Emma's shift ended 11 minutes ago. She is physically depleted, carrying only $16, but socioeconomic reality vanishes the moment she drops to the wet pavement to check his pulse. It is a mirrored trauma response. She performs the exact motion she used when her own father collapsed years ago. Trauma has a terrifying way of repeating itself in our actions. The life lesson is unyielding. Unresolved grief acts as a silent architect, forcing us to reenact our past helplessness in a futile attempt to rewrite the ending. Her tactile sensors detect a failing pulse, weak as a dying animal. Emma turns the subject over, exposing the severe lacerations. The sheer volume of blood soaking his white shirt indicates this was not a random altercation, but a highly organized, predatory assault. Her prefrontal cortex attempts to initiate a standard emergency protocol by reaching for her phone. However, her amygdala instantly overrides the action. It is fascinating how the nervous system detects apex predators before conscious thought forms. We must remember that our primal instincts, refined by millennia of survival, always trust the sudden spike of dread. It is warning her that the architect of this violence is likely still observing. You and I must analyze the crime scene precisely as she does. The alley lacks the usual chaotic debris of street violence. It is entirely sterile, exhibiting the methodical signature of an organized crime syndicate. Rather than fleeing, Emma searches the subject's coat, retrieving his identification. Ethan Sullivan, 34. Then, she uncovers the primary instrument of her psychological capture. A heavy, unmarked card falls into the contaminated water at her knees. Humans possess a fatal curiosity, a desperate need to find meaning in chaos. But the clinical truth is unforgiving. Digging for answers in a predator's territory does not provide closure. It only fastens the psychological restraints that will inevitably drag you down. The object in her hand is a study in coercive control. There is no name, only a gold-inked phone number, acting as a beacon for the syndicate. The text is an absolute directive: for emergencies only, call. Emma dials the number. The voice that answers after 2 rings demonstrates a chilling autonomic stability. There is no elevated heart rate, no panic, only the flat, deadened tone of a megalomaniac accustomed to total authority. Despite the immense psychological pressure, Emma asserts her identity and location. It is an irrational display of resilience. Hardship often forces the mind to construct incredible defenses, teaching us that genuine courage does not exist without paralyzing fear. She has officially announced her existence. Emma attempts to establish dominance by detailing the subject's critical condition, demanding a reciprocal emotional response. The auditory feedback she receives, however, is a calculated psychiatric void. The voice on the line demands the precise timeline of her discovery, completely ignoring her plea for medical intervention. When she begs for an ambulance, the syndicate boss issues a directive that fundamentally alters her reality. This is a classic display of megalomaniac narcissism. Ethan will not go to a hospital. She is forbidden to move him or speak. This is the absolute erasure of her autonomy. The lesson we observe here is grim but accurate. Up to individuals who hold supreme power prefer to bury their complications away from any clinical light. Bayerkheim, let us dissect this critical moment together. In criminal pathology, a subject's threat level correlates directly with their capacity for concealment. Normal citizens seek law enforcement. A man who deploys a specialized extraction team at 3 in the morning operates entirely outside societal parameters. Emma's nervous system screams at her to run, yet she verbally complies with the megalomaniac. The most disturbing clinical variable is that the boss leaves the line open. His measured, slow breathing filters through the speaker, establishing a psychological panopticon. He is monitoring her without being seen. It is a terrifying reality to accept, but true power never requires volume. It simply occupies your mental space permanently. The subject on the phone utilizes silence as an aggressive conditioning tool, forcing Emma to internalize his dominance. For 1 minute and 40 seconds, she remains paralyzed by the auditory phantom. Suddenly, Ethan regains consciousness. It is the hyper-aroused jolt of a man who knows vulnerability guarantees dead eyes. Lock onto. She tries to de-escalate, offering false assurances. This marks the initial trauma bond, the dark seat of Stockholm Syndrome, where a victim aligns with their source of danger. Ethan demands to know who she contacted. We see the tragic paradox of survival. The actions we take to secure salvation often trigger the very catastrophe we are trying to escape. Her rescue attempt is fatal. Ethan struggles against severe physical trauma, his baseline anxiety spiking violently. When Emma admits to dialing the number on the gold card, I observe a profound psychological collapse. The adrenaline of survival evaporates, replaced by the crushing weight of inevitable doom. It is the distinct, hollow expression of a fugitive who realizes his lifelong evasion has ended. His bloody fingers lock around her wrist in a vice grip of sheer panic. He asks if the architect of his misery answered the call directly. At her confirmation, Ethan's jaw clenches, his eyes shutting in complete surrender. Every human must eventually stand before the ledger of their decisions. In this chilling moment, Ethan accepts that his insurmountable debts are due. Ethan breaks through his pain to issue a critical directive, establishing a highly compressed 2-minute timeline before the extraction team arrives. He explicitly warns her that these men are desensitized enforcers capable of extreme violence. His final condition for her survival is total emotion suppression. She must not display fear. I find Emma's reaction remarkable. 12 years of managing hostile, unpredictable individuals in a nocturnal environment has fortified her stress tolerance. She possesses an ironclad ability to internalize terror without external leakage. She nods, accepting the grim terms of this transaction. Never dismiss the psychological armor forged by daily suffering. It provides the exact resilience needed to survive. The subject exhibits sudden remorse, recognizing he has infected a civilian with his lethal pathology. Before Emma can process his guilt, high-intensity headlights obliterate the visual field. 3 unmarked vehicles execute a synchronized tactical block of the alley. These are not standard responders. Massive enforcers deploy into the freezing rain, moving with the silent, predatory cohesion of a hive mind. They swarm Ethan, their non-verbal coordination entirely invalidating Emma's presence. In the cognitive mapping of apex predators, ordinary citizens do not register as human. An enforcer finally turns his dead, flat eyes toward her, commanding her to retreat. It is a raw display of dominance, enforcing the law that the weak must yield. In my years evaluating the criminal mind, I have rarely seen a mass drop quite like Vincent Sullivan's. The armored vehicle tears onto the wet asphalt, carrying a suffocating gravity. Out steps the undisputed kingpin. The moment his eyes find his bleeding son, Ethan, on the pavement, the sociopathic armor fractures. For one agonizing second, you and I witness the devastating truth. The raw agony of a father realizing his violent legacy has finally destroyed his own blood. But the megalomaniac narcissist cannot sustain vulnerability. He quickly buries that humanity behind a vault of cold steel, kneeling to press a trembling hand to his boy's pale cheek. The psychological truth here is brutally simple, a lesson we all eventually learn. We always reap the exact sorrow we sow in this life. Let us examine the waitress, Emma, through a clinical lens. She is backed tightly against the damp brick of a filthy alley, desperately trying to project innocence. But her wide eyes broadcast a trauma response she cannot suppress. Vincent does not just occupy the space, he completely eclipses it with the unhurried grace of an apex predator. When he tells her he knows she made the emergency call, it is not a guess. It is the cold calculus of a man whose empire relies on absolute cognitive dominance. You simply cannot disguise your terror from a predator who speaks the fluent language of human frailty. When survival is on the line, our polite fictions dissolve, leaving only the absolute truth exposed to the cold rain. The lesson is undeniable. Fear is the hardest secret to keep. Vincent remains perfectly still, studying her with the detached precision of a psychopath auditing a fragile contract. He searches her face for micro-expressions of deceit. Yet Emma refuses to shatter. She anchors herself to the whispered words Ethan gave her, forging defiance into a psychological shield. Then comes the ultimate pressure test. Vincent demands to know his son's waking words. It is a cognitive weight meant to crush ordinary minds. Emma meets his dead gaze without blinking, stating clearly that Ethan only asked if she was unharmed. It is an answer so disarmingly human, it genuinely short-circuits the kingpin's expectations. Remember this in your own life. True courage is never the absence of terror. It is planting your feet firmly while every single nerve begs you to run. The air in the alley grows thick, vibrating with lethal tension. Vincent issues one final interrogation, pressing her on whether those were truly his son's only words. Emma swallows hard, yet her baseline behavior does not shift. As silence settles over the damp pavement, a profound change alters Vincent's demeanor. It is devoid of warmth, but heavy with pathological respect. He recognizes this ordinary civilian is handing him the unvarnished truth. He states his son draws breath solely because of her, establishing a life debt he will never erase. Emma counters that she sought no reward. Character is always carved in the dark, in those terrifying moments when no one is watching. By choosing pure integrity over advantage, she just disarmed the most dangerous man in the city. For a fleeting second, the underworld architect betrays a flicker of genuine emotional comprehension. We see a subtle softening around his eyes as he catalogues her altruistic intentions. Then, the clinical detachment returns. He turns, and his operatives descend like shadows. The ambulance vanishes, the concrete is sterilized, and the violent trauma is entirely erased. He instructs Emma to return home, promising future contact. Before she retreats, he delivers a chilling behavioral truth. He warns her that fleeing only triggers a predator's instinct to hunt, while a steady walk might grant her mercy. Panic always paints a target on your back. Mastery over your own fear does not just project strength. It is the exact mechanism that secures your survival in a world governed by wolves. Let us map out the crushing psychological weight of those next 6 blocks. You and I can practically feel the adrenal exhaustion as Emma walks toward her apartment. Her legs are heavy as cast iron, suffocating in the dense silence. She finally breaches her door, throws the deadbolt, and collapses. The digital clock burns 2:49 into the dark room. Barely half an hour has evaporated, yet an entire trauma cycle has passed. Suddenly, her phone vibrates with an unknown number. It is Vincent, his voice reaching out through the dead of night to verify her safe arrival. The clinical irony is agonizing. Sometimes, the very darkness we sprint away from has already beaten the sanctuary, quietly waiting in the exact sanctuary we mistakenly thought was completely secure. A paralyzing frost cascades down her spine. When she asks how he knew she crossed her threshold, Vincent offers a chillingly mathematical reply. He simply calculated her average walking speed against the geographic distance. The narcissistic mind turned her trauma into a cold equation. After she confirms she is indoors, he sets the behavioral hook. He states his son intends to express his gratitude properly, framing it as an inescapable expectation rather than an offer. Every rational synapse in Emma's brain screams at her to sever the connection. Yet, guided by a primal instinct to appease a lethal captor, she hears her own voice quietly agree. Acknowledging that you are entirely out of your depth is often the crucial first step to surviving a deadly game. The board is now set. Just before severing the connection, Vincent weaves one final thread into his psychological trap. He notes his deliberate choice to believe her account, asking if she grasps the vast chasm between his belief and a simple request. We observe Emma's trembling hands. This is no polite invitation. It is an absolute edict handed down from an underworld sovereign. A colossal debt has just been chained to her identity, and her consent was never factored into his pathology. She murmurs her understanding, her spirit breaking a fraction. We have all stood at our own painful crossroads learning this harsh truth. Every choice we enact carries an invisible invoice, even the ones born from selfless kindness on a blood-stained street. Her quiet world has been permanently eclipsed by theirs. The line goes dead, and the resulting silence rings loud enough to shatter glass. We look at her table, where congealed soup and forgotten coffee stand as pitiful monuments to the mundane life she lost hours ago. She stares down at her trembling hands, the exact hands that kept a Mafia heir from bleeding out, and now clutching the calling card of a manipulative megalomaniac. She had been comfortably invisible, content in the quiet margins. But as the clock pushes past 3 in the morning, the cognitive dissonance dissolves. Her ordinary existence has been reduced to ash. We must recognize that innocence is a tragic, one-way door. Once you step beyond the threshold and witness the brutal mechanics of the dark, You cannot simply close your eyes and pretend the monsters do not exist. The true psychological marvel here is that Emma does not dwell on the morality of her actions. The only terror keeping her awake is the shapeless anxiety of what happens tomorrow. And the tragic certainty is that tomorrow is already arriving. Instead of packing a suitcase and vanishing, she physically anchors herself to normalcy. She clocks into her diner shift by 6:45 to brew cheap coffee, her face pale in the harsh, fluorescent light. You and I have probably engineered this exact cognitive denial during a personal crisis. When the fundamental pillars of your reality violently collapse, clinging to the mundane rhythm of your daily routine becomes a vital coping mechanism. It is the solitary anchor, preventing a total psychological fracture while barrage is tried, while the storm rages outside. Emma paces behind the laminate counter, mechanically refilling the coffee machine. She desperately constructs a mental fortress where Vincent Sullivan is merely a bad dream. She maintains this fragile dissociation until exactly 9:17. That is when the fantasy violently fractures. A massive black sedan glides up to the diner window with the predatory grace of a shark inspecting a cage. It does not park. Merely, its pitch-black idles, its pitch-black windows hiding an undeniable, looming threat. The sudden spike in cortisol causes Emma to spill scalding coffee across a customer's mug. The universe has a cruel sense of irony. Bearing a catastrophic problem in the back of your mind never starves it of oxygen. It merely affords the nightmare enough time to drive up and wait patiently at your front door. She attempts to rationalize the idling sedan as a mere coincidence, but the human nervous system rarely lies. Just before noon, the buzz of her phone shatters her fragile denial. Retreating to the dim sanctuary of the break room, she answers. It is not the kingpin, but a voice polished to a lethal smoothness. Daniel, an emissary of the syndicate, calls to confirm a 3 o'clock extraction. Panic overtakes her prefrontal cortex, and she wields her schedule like a fragile shield, protesting that her shift is far from over. The brutal reality of underworld power dynamics becomes painfully clear in this moment. True narcissistic authority never concerns itself with the trivial boundaries of your ordinary life. When the devil sets the rules, your only option is to play the hand you are dealt. Let us open this case file together and examine the behavioral baseline. Daniel is completely immune to the vocal tremors of his target. He repeats his directive with the flat tone typical of a high-functioning enforcer. The vehicle arrives at 3 o'clock, establishing absolute control. Emma enters an acute freeze response, gripping her telephone as if it might detonate. She dissociates, mechanically dragging a wet cloth over stained tables. When inescapable trauma approaches, the mind often reverts to repetitive tasks to endure the final moments before impact. At 2:55, the chime shatters the quiet. The psychological anticipation of ruin is often more excruciating than the trauma itself. Yet eventually, we all must turn and face the storm. Emma turns sharply, her nervous system flooding with adrenaline as she braces for the air. Instead, Daniel breaches the threshold. Encased in a dark suit, he is the physical manifestation of clinical psychopathy. His dead eyes scan the empty diner, segmenting the room into a tactical grid with predatory efficiency. Watching his motor functions is like studying a hyper-vigilant predator calculating its hunting ground. The exact second his polished shoes strike the linoleum, Emma's cognitive perception of safety is permanently fractured. We rarely get to orchestrate the defining psychological shifts of our lives. When the sheer embodiment of violence steps into your sanctuary, the only measurable victory left is maintaining your equilibrium and staying on your feet. Daniel is merely the preliminary stressor. Stepping in behind him is the primary subject. Ethan Sullivan is no longer the traumatized victim bleeding on the asphalt. He is meticulously reconstructed, a perfect specimen of generational wealth and suppressed violent tendencies. His unreadable eyes lock onto Emma, establishing immediate dominance. With a perfectly modulated, soft tone, he notes his early arrival. This is the classic behavioral paradox of absolute authority. Individuals with total control over their environment never require volume to enforce compliance. We often make the cognitive error of assessing a threat based on a prior moment of vulnerability. True psychological survival requires recognizing the lethal, predatory nature hiding beneath an expensive facade. Emma remains in motor paralysis, her posture projecting profound exhaustion. The stain on her uniform highlights her severe disadvantage. Clinically speaking, she is entirely unequipped for psychological warfare with an apex predator. Yet, overriding her primal survival instincts, she ignores his physical presence. She firmly requests 5 minutes and turns her back, a staggering display of boundary setting under duress. She approaches her supervisor, fabricating an emergency with steady motor control as she removes her apron. The human psyche is exceptionally skilled at synthesizing invisible armor from pure adrenaline. When dragged into a volatile environment, the most profound psychological rebellion is claiming a single minute to regulate your breathing and remember who you are. You and I must closely examine this sanctuary. Emma isolates herself in the cramped washroom, using it to regulate her acute panic. She makes eye contact with her reflection, vocalizing a spoken survival mantra. It is a fragile cognitive distortion, a necessary lie to maintain function. But observe her physiology as she re-enters the diner. Ethan deliberately stands from his seat. This archaic gesture of respect is a highly effective tactic of psychological destabilization. By presenting as a polite gentleman rather than an enforcer, he instantly dismantles her expected threat matrix. We spend our lives using avoidance behaviors to escape our core traumas. But true psychological evolution only initiates when we actively choose to walk directly back into the source of our terror. Emma collapses onto the adjacent stool, exhaustion overriding her defenses. She leans into his space, inquiring about his acute physical trauma. Ethan exhibits severe grandiosity, minimizing his near-fatal injuries as a trivial inconvenience. This is a classic narcissistic defense mechanism designed to deny vulnerability. But Emma acts as a clinical grounding force. Dropping her vocal register, she verbally forces him to confront his proximity to biological death. A micro-expression of profound grief crosses his features as he finally processes his own fragile mortality. Life rarely issues a warning before subjecting us to catastrophic stress. The definitive metric of human resilience is simply how we maintain our structural integrity when extreme pressure threatens to break us. The accusation of deception suspends in the air. Ethan delivers the word without any empathy. Emma deploys a defensive rationalization, framing her falsehood as a mere omission of variables. But the subject was conditioned in an environment of systemic betrayal. He understands that a tactical omission is typically a structurally sound lie. Surprisingly, his facial tension softens, signaling an absence of hostility. During his moment of critical blood loss, he analyzed her rapid cognitive processing. He watched her calculate a risk matrix and consciously choose to preserve his life. Trusting your unfiltered limbic system during an acute survival event is the pinnacle of adaptation. It signals to a predatory world that your internal resilience far exceeds your physical fragility. Let us observe the clinical shift here. Emma has endured a decade of chronic stress, utilizing avoidance to outpace her own anxiety. Across the counter, Ethan mirrors her exhaustion. He identifies her hypervigilance, having developed the same neural pathways within his lethal familial environment. They exist in synchronized silence, tethered by the markers of shared trauma. Exhibiting extreme caution, she asks if the attack was an isolated variable, though her subconscious has already processed the statistical impossibility of that scenario. You and I have likely utilized this exact coping mechanism. Sometimes the brain asks a question not to acquire data, but simply to purchase a few more seconds of cognitive denial before reality shatters the illusion entirely. His blink rate drops to 0. Certainty settles across his contused face as he verifies the assassination attempt originated from immediate relatives. He maintains eye contact, a rare manifestation of respect fracturing his clinical detachment. Emma's pattern recognition was already complete. She deduced the timed call was a calculated diversion, proving the aggressor possessed intimate operational knowledge. Ethan sets his mug down with a hyper-controlled precision that speaks to severe emotional suppression. This is a devastating pathological reality. Statistically, existential peril rarely approaches from an unknown variable. The most catastrophic traumas are consistently inflicted by those in our inner circle, individuals who've spent years studying our emotional blind spots. Ethan leans in, acknowledging she has dismantled his cognitive biases. He anticipated a traumatized civilian, but Emma counters with radical transparency. She admits to profound terror, functioning on a prolonged cortisol spike since dawn. Observe her jaw clench as she actively suppresses the urge to flee. During this vulnerability, Ethan's conditioned sociopathic exterior temporarily dissolves. For one measurable second, the isolated adolescent trapped within a criminal apparatus is visible. Then, he delivers the critical psychological strike. The patriarch requires her attendance tonight. We expend massive energy maintaining an impenetrable facade. True psychological courage is simply observing your own neurological tremors and refusing to surrender executive control to the panic. Emma enters a severe freeze response, the implications triggering a massive physiological drop. She rationalizes, arguing her exposure to the patriarch occurred during the chaotic blood loss. At 3 a.m, Ethan locks onto her, his expressions flatlining into affective detachment. The alleyway was an uncontrolled variable. Tonight is a highly controlled interrogation. The dawn, a textbook megalomaniacal narcissist, offers gratitude, but his clinical objective is to psychologically dissect Emma. He must comprehend the aberrant psychology of a civilian who manipulated a kingpin. We are defined by the covert choices we make in isolation. Inevitably, the environment forces you into the open, and you must maintain your cognitive baseline under intense scrutiny. Let us evaluate this scene together. Emma scans her predictable surroundings. The espresso machine hisses. An elderly patron turns a page. It is a fragile baseline of stability, resting on the edge of a violent paradigm. Exhibiting vocal tremors, she voices the ultimate avoidance query. What happens if she declines the summons? Ethan leans forward, communicating lethal severity. He outlines the pathological reality of a megalomaniacal narcissist. Her absence will create a psychological void, and his paranoid father will fill that space with an execution protocol. This provides a clinical lesson for us all. Using avoidance to cope with a catastrophic threat is a massive cognitive error. Retreating from an active predator does not ensure your safety. It merely flags you as defenseless prey. Observe the subject as she processes her lethal environment. In my clinical experience, allowing a paranoid megalomaniac to dictate reality guarantees a casualty. She whispers her compliance, releasing a fragmented laugh. This is not humor. It is severe cognitive overload. the sound of a psyche fracturing under duress. The heir watches her trauma response with dangerous fascination. They set their timeline for 7 o'clock. Then he drops a catastrophic variable, revealing his father has no idea he is even there. You and I are going to unpack this phenomenon together. When a subject is cornered with 0 viable exits, the brain often triggers paradoxical laughter. It is a primitive defense mechanism deployed simply to verify that your heart is still stubbornly beating. Note the subtle micro-expression in his jaw. Ethan has bypassed syndicate surveillance to deliver this warning, exhibiting behavior I would categorize as pathological altruism. His strategy is a staggering miscalculation of risk. He instructs her to enter the apex predator's domain and confess the absolute truth. Ethan fully intends to absorb the catastrophic wrath of his father, acting as a human shield against the violence he was raised in. The dim lighting casts shadows over a son willing to self-destruct for a civilian. It offers a fundamental lesson in human behavior. True guardianship is never about sheltering someone from reality. It is the conscious, agonizing choice to step directly into the line of fire, so an innocent psyche does not have to shatter entirely. Emma visually processes the contusions mapping his skin, the physical markers of systemic familial abuse. She presents the fundamental variable. Why would an elite syndicate heir risk annihilation for a collateral civilian? He allows a silence to form, saturated with years of compartmentalized trauma. Having witnessed his father's megalomania destroy countless lives, he refuses to let her psyche become the next casualty. He deposits 2 bills on the table and retreats. Instead of pursuing the financial deficit, she halts him at the door, demanding the exact confession he murmured in the alley. It is a dark reality of human resilience. The individuals who fight the hardest to pull you out of the abyss are usually the ones who grew up buried alive inside it. The subject experiences a textbook phenomenon known as auditory exclusion. The ambient noise of the diner dissolves into a suffocating psychological void. Ethan maintains intense ocular focus, stretching the tension until it generates physical distress. When he speaks, his tone carries the hollow resonance of a fractured identity. He reveals the assassination attempt was an internal syndicate operation. Detonating that psychological bomb, he exits into the brutal city. Emma remains immobilized, isolated as cognitive dissonance shatters her reality. The enforcers guarding the kingpin are the actual predators. It is a terrifying behavioral truth. Building massive walls to keep monsters out means absolutely nothing when the psychopaths are already living inside the house with you. Let us step back and examine this psychological escalation together. An internal faction attempted to execute the heir, and the megalomaniac patriarch is blind to his son's awareness. Now, a civilian holds a catastrophic secret. The narrative shifts to Emma, preparing for a hostile interrogation masked as dinner. A fortified sedan arrives at 6:55. The enforcer opens the door, simulating the jaws of a steel trap, yet her motor functions remain steady. She enters without hesitation. We observe a fascinating mechanism of the human mind here. The true agony of any crisis is the cognitive paralysis of standing at the edge of the precipice. But once you force yourself into freefall, the anxiety evaporates, replaced only by the cold mechanics of pure survival. We observe Emma pressing against the tinted glass. Using sensory grounding to manage her panic, the chaotic city fades into the heavily sanitized space of the criminal elite. This transit represents a complete immersion into a highly toxic, narcissistic territory. Her musculature remains rigid, bound by the raw survival instinct triggered by the warning. The vehicle halts before a remarkably understated residence. There is no visible security apparatus here. Instead, there is only the unnerving arrogance of unchecked sociopathy and limitless capital. It provides a sobering clinical reminder. Lethal danger rarely announces itself with violent noise. Far more often, it waits for you with infinite patience behind a perfectly silent, meticulously polished door. The fortified entry opens before she breaks the proximity threshold. A woman presenting as a harmless, maternal archetype stands in the light. To an analyst, this is a manipulation tactic, projecting domestic safety to disarm the target. She addresses Emma with modulated warmth, announcing the patriarch is waiting. The instant she crosses the boundary, environmental noise is surgically severed, replaced by the silence of a sensory deprivation chamber. The caretaker moves through the corridors without verifying compliance, indicating absolute systemic control. This dynamic offers a chilling revelation. Frequently, the individuals deployed to greet you with the most comforting smiles are the exact operatives hired to manage the locks on the most unforgiving psychological cages. You and I have likely analyzed that precise autonomic response, the severe physiological drop when a subject crosses the point of no return. The mechanism engages behind Emma, sealing her inside the controlled environment. Following the operative is her only survival vector. She stops before towering double doors. The caretaker taps twice, projecting a fabricated sociopathic charm casually offering coffee. Emma suppresses her tremors. The operative retreats into the periphery, leaving the subject entirely isolated. This is the critical baseline moment. Life routinely demands these massive, agonizing intakes of oxygen right before we step into the behavioral void to confront the absolute worst of human nature. She forcefully breaches the heavy wooden doors. Vincent deliberately denies her visual acknowledgement, forcing the civilian to stand in his expansive territory like an insignificant anomaly. I have interviewed dozens of syndicate leaders, and this calculated silence is a classic dominance display. It's precisely how a megalomaniac narcissist fractures a psyche before a single word is spoken. When Vincent finally rotates, his previous frantic emotionality is entirely eradicated. He is encased in perfectly tailored armor. The apex predator has reclaimed his throne, yet his ocular presentation remains a vacant void. You can meticulously wrap a sociopath in the finest luxury textiles, but the total absence of empathy in his stare will always telegraph the absolute violence he is capable of. Let us dissect this encounter piece by piece, shall we? The psychological warfare here is a masterclass in manipulation. Vincent scans her biometrics. Deconstructing her defenses with a visual sweep, he delivers a surgically polite greeting. Emma locks her joints to prevent an autonomic collapse. Rather than using his desk as a barricade, Vincent sits directly in her physical space. It is an intentional spatial violation. He casually notes his son reported her transport refusal. Instantaneous, omnispiking her cortisol, he projects omniscient control over his offspring. This is a brutal clinical truth. We assume hiding behind barriers ensures survival. But a true sociopath understands that stripping away your physical distance is exactly what triggers the ultimate biological freeze response. A micro-expression of amusement alters Vincent's face. He clinically probes her to extract the data his son transmitted. Emma maintains unyielding eye contact, anchoring her resolve to the trauma bond formed with the air. Under immense compression, she initiates her countermeasure. With a detached delivery, she injects the fatal truth. Ethan identified the internal faction responsible for the execution order. The atmospheric pressure drops. The megalomaniac completely ceases respiration. His musculature locks into absolute rigidity. A dominant threat is measured entirely by the payload required to paralyze him. The lesson is scientifically verified. Our most catastrophic psychological trauma invariably originates from our own bloodline, because they are the only ones holding the bypass codes to our armor. Observe this critical inflection point with me. You and I understand the suffocating nature of an acoustic void. The patriarch maintains external stillness, but his cognitive architecture is violently collapsing. He vocalizes a microscopic whisper asking for confirmation. I note the involuntary tremor in his mandible. It is a pure biological manifestation of acute grief. Emma confirms the data with the chilling detachment of a forensic accountant. The apex predator fails to process a response for 6 agonizing seconds. The feed lingers on his devastated posture. Enduring dead air from a lethal threat induces the exact neurological panic of drowning beneath ice. We constantly generate noise in our lives because absolute silence strips away our delusions, forcing us to process the horrific realities we wish to avoid. Vincent forces his weight out of the leather chair. His frame drags as though bound by invisible chains. He gravitates toward the rain-streaked glass. Emma observes the structural collapse of a terrified father, an apex predator finally absorbing the psychological bullet he anticipated for decades. He speaks to his reflection, questioning why Ethan would transfer his trauma to a girl he barely knew. Emma displays zero autonomic response. She states her anonymity was the very mechanism of his safety. Handing a secret to a ghost allowed his son to bypass the pathological manipulation of the syndicate. It exposes a fascinating defect in human attachment. When our primary caregivers hold the sharpest blades, the only viable sanctuary becomes an absolute stranger in the dark. Vincent rotates with agonizing slowness. Let us review this behavioral sequence together. You and I. He pins her beneath a predatory gaze. The portrait of a megalomaniac narcissist extracting truth from a civilian because his men are paralyzed by fear. He murmurs that her cognitive functioning is sharper than she projects. Emma rejects the psychological manipulation, asserting she is exactly the baseline profile she appears to be. The room plunges into a clinical silence. Then the patriarch almost smiles. It is a micro-expression of respect before his iron pathology returns. We see a fascinating paradox here. The most dominant personalics starve for the one thing power cannot extract. A subject brave enough to maintain eye contact and deliver the cold truth. Emma catalogs the shifts in his facial musculature. She differentiates between a theatrical affect and the fracturing of a sociopathic defense mechanism. Tonight, she evaluates the psychological ruins of an empire builder. As Vincent sinks down, the ambient threat level drops. He quietly requests her personal history. Emma had cognitively prepared for a hostile interrogation. Instead, this apex predator displays an anomalous, genuine curiosity. She whispers that her background lacks a compelling narrative. Vincent counters, noting that repressed subjects frequently possess the highest clinical value. We learn a profound lesson from this dynamic. The most aggressive personalities are often empty shells, while the silent observers endure the heaviest emotional burdens. Emma details her caregiver's terminal decline and her own survival adaptations, exhibiting zero signs of self-pity. Her vocal cadence is flat, indicative of severe childhood parentification. She admits her total lack of a support system. Vincent processes this, letting the vacuum of her isolation register. He notes she used the alley as an evasion tactic, probing why she interrupted her flight response for a bleeding stranger. Emma confesses a lack of conscious motivation. Vincent diagnoses her instantly. She possesses an uncontrollable, pathological empathy. Modern conditioning dictates we ignore distress signals, to preserve ourselves. The stark clinical reality is that unregulated empathy will inevitably pull a subject directly into collateral destruction. Vincent leans forward. Let us examine this clinical pivot together. He explains that survival requires subjects to systematically desensitize themselves to external trauma. It is a baseline defense mechanism, yet he observes her failure to develop this numbness. He states her maladaptive empathy is precisely what preserved his son. Those words dissolve his remaining sociopathic barriers. Emma inquires about Ethan's recovery. Vincent notes his son is exhibiting high hostility, a primary indicator of psychological resilience. Ethan only withdraws into silence when his core identity fractures. This reinforces a vital behavioral truth. We frequently classify anger as a destructive pathology, but raw hostility is often the final biological mechanism proving an organism refuses to simply expire. The rigid architecture of the crime lord disintegrates. Notice the tremors exposing the panic of a deteriorating father figure. Vincent studies Emma, his tone saturated with the clinical paranoia of a subject overexposed to systemic violence. He asks if she experiences genuine relief that his son survived. Emma maintains direct eye contact, issuing a simple affirmative. Vincent leans in, manifesting the exhaustion of an eroded psyche. He questions her projected application of this volatile data. She answers with absolute neutrality, stating she will do nothing. In a subculture governed by lethal betrayal, we observe a fascinating psychological reality. The supreme commodity is never capital. It is cognitive trust, the radical decision to archive another person's trauma in total silence. Emma maintains her spatial dominance, reiterating her zero-action protocol. Her voice demonstrates no stress fluctuations, yet suggests with severe internal compartmentalization. She intends to resume her employment and actively repress the entire criminal exposure. She refuses financial compensation or reciprocal favors, rejecting integration into their sociopathic hierarchy. Vincent processes her denial in absolute silence, the ticking clock serving as an auditory anchor. However, any behavioral analyst understands the profound fallacy of her logic. Trauma exposure irreversibly alters neuroplasticity. Once a subject is introduced to high-level systemic violence, the conscious mind cannot simply delete the data. Those neural pathways, once forcibly activated, remain permanently accessible. Vincent launches a rapid verbal countermeasure. This is where the behavioral dynamic shifts. He notes her projected innocence perfectly mirrors the profile of an embedded operative. Emma processes the paranoia, explaining the logical impossibility of proving a negative. The cognitive burden of trust rests entirely on his deteriorated psyche. Vincent regulates his respiration, conceding he will accept her narrative. He then issues a definitive warning regarding the contamination of classified data. In a predatory ecosystem, altruistic motivations hold zero value. We observe an autonomic nervous response in Emma as her spine goes rigid. It highlights a brutal psychiatric truth. Moral purity provides no biological armor against a malignant environment. Emma dissects the cognitive distortion in his assessment. The secondary subjects within the syndicate lack his empathy, defaulting to lethal force. She decreases her vocal volume to introduce a critical variable. A threat vector just attempted to terminate his son, positioning her as a statistical anomaly. The architect of that strike will systematically eliminate such data. Vincent exhibits muscular rigidity, though a micro-expression of shock disrupts his affect. He acknowledges she deviates from his predictive models. Emma experiences an acute stress response. Ethan vocalized that identical observation hours prior. We witness a profound manifestation of generational conditioning. Subjects frequently accelerate toward catastrophic outcomes through their frantic attempts at avoidance. Vincent dismantles his psychological barricades. He confesses a predictive bias, anticipating she would extort him for capital. He categorized this as an operational expense, yet it would have finalized the collapse of his sociological optimism. Emma sustains direct ocular contact, deploying defensive sarcasm. She expected a financial transaction designed to test her moral elasticity. Vincent leans in, his curiosity stimulated, probing her hypothetical decision matrix. Emma states she would execute both options to maximize efficiency. The patriarch physically manifests a fractured smile. We dedicate decades to constructing elaborate psychological armor, but profound resilience is demonstrated by intentionally exposing our structural vulnerabilities to another human subject. The environmental baseline violently destabilizes. You and I are going to unpack this transition together. Vincent reassumes his pathological dominance as the apex predator, locking his visual focus. He clarifies he is not deploying financial assets. He is extending a high-value survival mechanism. He breaches the door, and his enforcement asset materializes from the perimeter. Vincent issues a low-decibel directive, and she extracts herself. He forces an untraceable cellular device into Emma's palm, establishing a protocol to initiate contact at the first symptom of surveillance. The clinical reality is that absolute security is a cognitive hallucination. Frequently, the very behavioral shields we construct to prevent trauma become the exact markers attracting hostile attention. Emma exhibits physical tremors, manifesting a sympathetic nervous response. She questions the probability of a lethal threat. Vincent calibrates his response with caution, like a technician disarming an explosive. He requires her integration into his security apparatus until the threat stabilizes. Ethan suddenly enters the space. He instantly processes the rigid biomechanics of his father, decoding the scenario. Ethan states she transferred the classified data. Emma softly counters that he initiated the psychological surrender. They establish sustained eye contact, locked in an emotional conflict, indicative of a developing trauma bond. Profound psychological trauma is rarely inflicted through verbal aggression. It is generated by the suffocating silence of our primary attachments. Observe the pathological tension as Vincent fires his interrogation. Ethan refuses to flinch, but his jaw clenches with immense pressure. That microscopic delay betrays his defensive structure. Projecting a desperate glance toward Emma, the son attempts to assert control, demanding the discussion end. Vincent, exhibiting megalomaniacal grandiosity, crushes the rebellion instantly. Ethan tries to categorize the girl as a mere civilian, but the narcissistic patriarch ruthlessly reframes her reality, declaring her and clinical dynamic together. Let us examine this clinical dynamic together, shall we? When a system operates on a generational cycle of trauma, stepping up to shield one innocent variable is often the only psychological mechanism a broken man has left to retain his own humanity. Emma shrinks into the upholstery, paralyzed as a captive audience to this vicious hostility. Imagine the cognitive dissonance of existing inside this behavioral loop, where every interaction is a landmine. Ethan locks his traumatized eyes onto hers, but she refuses to break the connection. We are witnessing the embryonic stages of Stockholm Syndrome as the victim becomes emotionally tethered to the figures dragging her into their orbit. Finally, the psychological weight crushes the young heir, and he verbalizes a single trigger word: Caruso. The hostility in his tone contaminates the room. This observation highlights a profound behavioral reality. We only begin to neutralize the subconscious terrors governing our actions the exact moment we drag them into the light and identify them. That specific name drifts through the clinical space like thick smoke. Notice how Vincent allows the variable to hang there, his facial muscles freezing into a sociopathic mask. The psychological dam has ruptured for Ethan, his repressed hostility echoing against the walls. He documents that Caruso has been draining resources for 6 months while his narcissistic father paralyzed him. Driven by ego threat, Ethan admits to launching an impulsive strike resulting in severe physical trauma. The subsequent silence is suffocating. Vincent verbalizes profound devastation, processing that his biological extension orchestrated a rogue operation. Ethan defends his autonomy unashamed. It proves a vital diagnostic truth. Systemic toxicity always metastasizes fastest in silence, feeding on the realities we refuse to confront. Vincent demands an explanation, his vocal register dropping to a menacing frequency. Ethan glares at his primary caretaker, stating he knew the patriarch would suppress his agency. The visible trauma washing over Vincent is clinically fascinating. We are observing the narcissistic collapse of a megalomaniac, realizing his empire is deteriorating from within. Stick with me, because the pathology deepens here. Vincent processes that his son hypothesized a systemic infiltration, believing their own inner circle would betray them. Offering no verbal defense, Ethan allows the silence to serve as his admission. Vincent physically withdraws, severing eye contact. It illustrates a devastating behavioral paradox. The psychological walls you construct to keep threats at bay often serve only to lock the true predators inside with you. Emma observes the physical tension evacuate Vincent's posture. It is the deflation of a megalomaniac collapsing under perceived disloyalty. Directing his focus to the window pane, Vincent interrogates the timeline of this suspected infiltration. Ethan swallows aggressively, his maladaptive arrogance neutralized. 4 months. That metric strikes the aging narcissist like blunt force trauma, dismantling his cognitive defenses. He cannot process such prolonged deception from his genetic extension. Ethan emotionally shatters, admitting he lacked empirical data, relying only on an injury and paranoid intuition. In this exact frame, the criminal persona dissolves, revealing a profoundly terrified adolescent. Deactivating your emotional armor is terrifying, yet it remains the only method to dismantle the cages built by our pathological pride. This interaction systematically dismantles the grandiose illusion of syndicate behavior, exposing a fractured child desperate for paternal validation. Emma remains frozen as the silence amplifies the diagnostic severity of the room. Vincent pivots from his reflection, a pathological patriarch caught between his fabricated ruthless identity and the biological terror of losing his offspring. He analyzes the damaged air he conditioned, then recalibrates his focus onto the captive variable. Miss Turner, he states, intentionally modulating his tone to simulate empathy. He issues a formal apology, acknowledging her accidental intersection with their violent environment. This scenario validates a deeply inequitable systemic truth. The most severe consequences rarely target the primary instigators. They invariably crush the innocent bystanders caught in the crossfire. The narcissistic leader allows that grim assessment to permeate the environment. He reiterates his remorse, acknowledging that forced heroism offers zero adaptive benefits. Emma clinically evaluates the aging sociopath. He wears his paternal distress like a secondary skin, flawlessly presented yet suffocatingly dense. She visualizes the initial encounter, juxtaposing the reality where both the megalomaniac and the violent enforcer modify their behavior to preserve a civilian. Refusing a submissive posture, she establishes a firm psychological boundary. Do not apologize yet, she counters with remarkable stability. Let us evaluate the final survival metrics first. You and I have likely both misdiagnosed individuals, but the profound irony of human behavior is discovering absolute integrity within the exact subject's society diagnoses as entirely irredeemable. We, the subject states. It is a microscopic linguistic shift, but she deploys it as a psychological anchor, integrating herself into their dysfunctional unit. This is a fascinating manifestation of her developing trauma bond. The mechanical rhythm of the clock meticulously tracks the termination of her previous baseline reality. Outside the perimeter, the civilian population remains ignorant that a service worker has breached a classified boundary. The avoidant girl who subsisted on minimal resources has been permanently erased. Sustaining direct eye contact with both apex predators, she firmly plants herself in their chaotic behavioral loop. It forces an examination of a fascinating cognitive paradox. The traumatic disruptions we spend our lives avoiding rarely align with our conscious planning, but they invariably force us into the exact evolutionary crucible we require for vital growth. Extracting herself from the compound, the subject immediately resumes her occupational baseline by sunrise. This demonstrates a phenomenal capacity for cognitive compartmentalization. Emma processes acute, lethal stimuli, then seamlessly pivots to routine service tasks as if the trauma never registered. Pragmatic survival supersedes emotional processing, as financial obligations remain absolute. However, her psychological framework is visibly deteriorating. The initial surveillance vehicle has been swapped for a silver model, holding a predatory position near her workplace. Different visual markers, identical threatening stasis. The environmental data consistently provides observable threat indicators, whispering that the catastrophic event has already breached the perimeter. If only we would cease our maladaptive denial and objectively analyze the behavioral evidence. The secondary vehicle maintains its coordinate until late morning before executing a stealth withdrawal. Almost instantly, a tertiary sedan occupies the exact same observational vector. If the megalomaniacal patriarch had not previously calibrated her threat detection responses, this coordinated surveillance rotation would have bypassed her awareness completely. She actively suppresses her autonomic nervous system, understanding that broadcasting distress signals will only accelerate a predator's attack sequence. During peak hours, an unidentified male occupies an obscured seating area. He consumes 0 items, fixates on his device, and leaves a $20 note, completely avoiding visual engagement. This highlights a terrifying psychological absolute. The specimens exhibiting the most suppressed external behavior are statistically the ones harboring the most lethal internal directives. Emma executes her service protocol, projecting a fabricated affect while covertly dissecting his defensive posture. Observe how he aligns his vertebrae rigidly against the structural barrier, his ocular movements obsessively scanning the primary entry point. This is the somatic blueprint of a subject operating under chronic hypervigilance, anticipating imminent violence. When the hostile variable finally vacates the premises, she identifies a compressed paper anomaly beneath his discarded tableware. Suppressing her cortisol response, she conceals the artifact with practiced neutrality. Within the isolation of the corridor, she exposes the text. 5 stark words. Do not go home tonight. We must integrate this empirical truth into our understanding. The most devastating psychological ruptures in our existence rarely announce themselves with auditory violence. They infiltrate our reality through the most silent channels. She remains immobilized in the corridor, the ambient silence triggering an acute stress response. Overriding her paralysis, she conceals the threat indicator and re-enters the chaotic public environment. By mid-afternoon, the compounding psychological weight induces an imminent systemic failure. She isolates herself inside the temperature-controlled storage unit, the harsh thermal drop failing to regulate her spiking heart rate. Exhibiting severe desperation, she initiates contact with the narcissistic kingpin, discarding all hierarchical boundaries. "Did you leave this note?" She interrogates, her vocal stability fracturing. A dense pause precedes Vincent's response, "No." In that second, her conceptualization of safety disintegrates. It delivers a ruthless clinical conclusion. When you synthesize the cognitive bravery to vocalize your most terrifying inquiries, you must be absolutely braced for the resulting data to completely obliterate your functioning reality. Let us open this case file together, observing Emma isolated in the harsh light. She clings to the receiver as Vittorio, a textbook megalomaniac narcissist, manipulates her from the shadows. His voice drips with a calculated vulnerability designed to bind the subject to him. He orders her to trust only the code word, November. We see her acute stress response, her knuckles anchoring her against a panic attack. She admits her terror, but promises strict compliance, sealing her psychological tether. The patriarch exhales, cementing his dominance through a feigned weariness. It is a vital clinical observation that genuine bravery is never a lack of fear. It is the agonizing choice to step forward into the unknown, even when your nervous system screams at you to run. Emma remains in the diner, exhibiting the hyper-compliant behavior typical of early-stage captive bonding. She scrubs the machines aggressively, a coping mechanism to discharge the kinetic energy of her adrenaline spikes. When questioned about her pacing, showing her survival instincts have overridden her baseline honesty. At 3 o'clock, the entrance bell rings. She anticipates a threat, but Ethan enters. His physical presentation shows profound sleep deprivation, driven purely by reckless loyalty to a narcissistic father. We often expect life to provide a pristine, idealized rescue from our crises. In reality, survival usually arrives in the form of another deeply fractured individual, just broken enough to understand the exact shape of your trauma. Ethan delivers the trigger word, November, his voice strained by acute physiological stress. Emma responds with a rigid nod, showing a micro-expression of relief as her cognitive load temporarily lightens. Ethan outlines their escape window, his posture indicating severe anxiety. Interestingly, his megalomaniac father never ordered this extraction. This broken heir voluntarily placed himself in the line of fire. Shedding her apron, Emma abandons all societal norms and flees toward an unmarked sedan at the curb. Ethan accelerates the absolute second she is secured inside. This perfectly illustrates a fundamental behavioral truth. To genuinely place your trust in another person, you must completely surrender your comforting illusion of control, accepting whatever chaos lies ahead. Inside the vehicle, Ethan displays clinical hypervigilance, his eyes constantly scanning the mirrors for threats. He methodically deconstructs her cognitive distortions. The massive cash tip she received was not an anomaly of generosity, but a targeted psychological strike by an operative tracking her. Emma attempts to rationalize the threat, suggesting they merely want to frighten her. Ethan immediately shatters this defense mechanism. He clarifies that their goal is a lethal outcome, noting that fearful subjects make unpredictable errors, while deceased subjects cannot testify. You and I must understand this critical dynamic. Naive innocence is merely a psychological comfort blanket. It offers absolutely zero tangible protection once apex predators catch your scent and begin the hunt. Ethan forcefully navigates the vehicle through traffic, demonstrating the aggressive motor control typical of high-stress avoidance behaviors. He shares a critical variable in this behavioral equation. His narcissistic father has been conducting relentless interrogations since midnight, methodically hunting for a syndicate mole. Hogan's syndicate mole. This traitor is now cornered, and as any criminal psychologist knows, a trapped subject inevitably commits fatal operational errors. Leaving a physical warning for Emma was a profound tactical miscalculation. Emma stares out the window, experiencing an acute grief response for her previously unremarkable life. It is a sobering psychological reality that humans rarely appreciate the profound stability of a mundane existence until catastrophic chaos violently removes it. Emma processes the acute trauma of the last 36 hours, her entire baseline reality thoroughly shattered. Ethan outlines their trajectory toward a secure location, stating his father requires 12 hours of containment protocols. When this hardened operative attempts an emotional apology, Emma exhibits a fascinating psychological pivot. She rejects the helpless victim persona entirely, asserting total ownership over her current predicament. She refuses to validate his savior complex. Ethan studies her with a mixture of clinical awe and perceived danger. This interaction underscores a profound truth about human attachment. Durable bonds of mutual respect are almost never developed in safe environments. They are forged under the extreme pressure of facing life-threatening terror together. The subjects transition from the urban center to an isolated residential sector, arriving at an unremarkable brownstone. Ethan claims ownership of the property, distinctly separating this space from his father's criminal enterprise. We must note the stark environmental contrast. Vittorio's estate is a calculated architectural weapon designed to project narcissistic dominance. Ethan's residence, conversely, is profoundly ordinary. It functions as a psychological decompression chamber, a hidden environment where a conditioned enforcer can shed his hypervigilant state. This brings us to a fascinating analytical principle. You and I can accurately diagnose the true core of any individual simply by examining the private, unguarded sanctuary they construct when the public eye is completely removed. Examining the interior, we observe mundane artifacts, worn books, a discarded mug, a casual jacket. Despite standing within the territory of an enforcer, Emma's autonomic nervous system begins to downregulate. Ethan moves to the kitchen, offering a self-deprecating remark to intentionally lower the interpersonal tension. Emma attempts to sustain her defensive posture, but the physiological debt of sustained terror cannot be ignored. Her adrenal exhaustion forces a complete somatic surrender. She collapses onto the sofa, dropping her protective facade. This demonstrates a universal psychological mechanism. We construct incredibly dense emotional armor to navigate hostile realities. But eventually, the human brain requires a safe, uncurated space just to breathe. The nocturnal environment amplifies Emma's residual trauma, prompting her to utilize paced breathing to manage an encroaching panic attack. Ethan monitors her vocal effect from the kitchen. She deploys a masking behavior, requesting mundane conversation to ground her spiraling cognition. Ethan volunteers a highly vulnerable biographical detail. He reveals a suppressed adolescent desire to become an architect. This constructive ambition was forcefully terminated when familial illness triggered the syndicate's demand for a violent heir. It is a textbook case of intergenerational trauma eclipsing individual potential. We often find that the idealized futures we map out must be completely dismantled so that the people tethered to us might somehow survive the impending storm. Emma introduces a high-risk psychological probe, asking if he resents his violent conditioning. Ethan exhibits a physical freeze response. He confesses that observing architectural beauty triggers acute somatic pain, requiring him to actively dissociate from his suppressed identity. Shifting the analytical focus, he leans against the doorframe and questions her adolescent ambitions. Emma experiences her own cognitive pause, confronting a forgotten self-concept. She quietly admits she wanted to be an educator, accessing memories long paved over by daily survival. This exchange highlights a devastating behavioral pattern. The most authentic fragments of our core identity are frequently buried under the relentless, exhausting cognitive load of simply maintaining our daily survival. As Emma verbalizes memories of her mother validating her early ambitions, Ethan's sociopathic masking completely dissolves. He queries her failure to pursue this vocation, and Emma provides a practical rationalization. Systemic pressures hijacked her trajectory, mirroring his own psychological amputation. Ethan maintains sustained eye contact, his standard predatory calculation entirely replaced by deep cognitive empathy. This shared grief over abandoned potential creates a significant therapeutic rupture in their defense mechanisms. He provides her with a basic meal which her depleted system registers as profound care. We expend immense psychological energy-building fortifications, yet our actual salvation occurs only when we dismantle those walls to accept genuine human nourishment. This temporary clinical stabilization is inherently fragile. Emma initiates a confrontation, her effect hardening as she demands accurate intelligence regarding the rival leader, Caruso. Ethan's postural shift is immediate and severe. The empathetic host is overwritten by the inherited pathological traits of his megalomaniac father. He details how Caruso maintained an 8-year truce, only to launch a lethal offensive the second Vittorio attempted to transfer control to his son. It was an opportunistic strike triggered by perceived weakness. Listen closely, as this mirrors a harsh societal reality. The precise moment you reduce your threat posture to experience temporary peace, an external aggressor will inevitably test your boundaries to verify if you can still bite. Let us open this case file together and examine the pathology. The dim light exposes a severe tremor in Ethan's hands, a physical response to immense guilt. He explains how small errors escalated into a narcissistic need for dominance. By cutting the Caruso supply line, he sought to prove his independence, deliberately isolating his father. Emma studies his fractured defense mechanisms. She diagnoses his core wound, stating bluntly that he just wanted to prove he could wear the crown alone. The silence is suffocating. We frequently inflict the most devastating psychological damage on the people who raised us, simply to test our own autonomy. Seeking the guidance of those who came before us is not a weakness. It is an adaptive trait for surviving a brutal world. Ethan collapses under the weight of her psychological evaluation, rubbing his exhausted eyes. He introduces a critical stressor. A deeply embedded family member has betrayed his security. Emma leans forward, probing to see who possessed access to such classified intelligence. Ethan admits that only his father's most conditioned subjects, Luca and Dom, were briefed. Pushed to his limit, he articulates his darkest suspicion. His instincts scream that Dom is the traitor, but his father demands empirical evidence against a phantom. It is a textbook manifestation of systemic paranoia. Trust functions exactly like a pane of pristine glass. The moment you detect a microscopic fracture, you spend the rest of your life terrified the entire structure will violently shatter under pressure. Observe how the psychological warfare rapidly escalates. Emma displays severe hypervigilance, physically flinching at the sound of passing tires. Her analytical mind connects disparate data points in the gloom. She hypothesizes the threatening message, mnemonizes the internal mole. Mole fed the enemy her identity. The opposition knows she stood inside the patriarch's inner sanctum, and they are suffering cognitive dissonance. Calculating what intelligence she gathered, Ethan is paralyzed by her clinical deduction, demanding her logical framework. This exposes a fundamental behavioral truth. Fear acts as an incredibly precise compass. If you need to uncover a subject's hidden pathology, simply sit back and study exactly what causes them to violently panic in the dark. We focus on Emma's effect as she maps out the subject's mental state. She clinically explains that the traitor is suffocating under extreme paranoid ideation. The mole observed a civilian being escorted into the command center, followed by urgent communications. Looking Ethan in the eyes, she delivers the psychological reality. The enemy is targeting her precisely because they lack data on what she knows. In behavioral science, the unknown generates exponentially more terror than a confirmed threat. Ethan is stunned by her rapid cognitive processing. She offers a tight smile, noting she had hours to analyze the variables while working. Your mind remains your most lethal instrument. Even when stripped of all physical agency, the ability to connect hidden variables is a defense mechanism no adversary can disable. Ethan observes her with clinical fascination. He validates her theory, recognizing that this informational asymmetry is a massive source of leverage. Her survival depends on the enemy's paralyzing fear of her unconfirmed intelligence. Realizing the patriarch must be briefed, Ethan dials the number, placing the device on the table when Vincent answers. The phone sits between them, acting as a volatile psychological bridge connecting her civilian reality to their violent syndicate. Ethan informs the kingpin she has critical data to present. Pay attention to this behavioral mechanism. The specific vulnerability that marks you as prey can often be inverted and weaponized into an impenetrable shield, allowing your adversaries to obsess over how the quiet secrets you might hold is a highly effective survival strategy. Emma leans toward the speaker, discarding all social pleasantries. She delivers her assessment to the boss, classifying the warning note not as a tactical threat, but as a manifestation of severe panic. Her existence is driving the traitor into suffocating paranoia. The static silence on the line is thick. Vincent awes heavily, processing her cognitive strategy to position herself as live bait. She remains clinically detached, noting the bait is already in the water. Ethan attempts to interject his hypothesis about Dom, but Vincent barks a sharp command, establishing absolute dominance over his son. This highlights a brutal truth of survival. When you cease your flight response and deliberately turn an enemy's traps against them, you shed the fragile psychology of the victim and evolve into the apex predator. You and I have seen this pathology before. Deep psychological trauma rarely originates from shadows. It sits at your dinner table. Ethan pleads with his father to process the empirical data. The informant knew Emma was at the compound, dispatching an operative to her workplace by early afternoon. Only a subject managing internal logistics could execute that timeline, and Luca lacks that clearance. The silence simulates dirt, striking a coffin. Ethan confirms Dom is the sole variable with that access. The atmosphere shifts into profound mourning. Vincent experiences an acute emotional fracture, whispering that Dom stood by him for 22 years. It is a terrifying reality of human attachment. You can grant someone unconditional trust, only to discover they spent every hour forging a weapon to dismantle your life. Analyzing the vocal modulation, Vincent resembles a decaying monarch, trying to restrain a psychological hurricane. He suppresses his emotional devastation, trapped in the cognitive dissonance that Dom was family for 2 decades. Emma breaks eye contact, trespassing on a private grief ritual. Ethan corrects his posture, maintaining clinical detachment as he guarantees undeniable proof. He petitions his father to let him excise the traitor surgically. Vincent releases a ragged X-variables. Vincent releases a ragged exhalation. His primitive brain demands he execute the punishment personally. But after an agonizing struggle, the king yields. He quietly instructs his son to outline the strategy. This is the moment of succession. Eventually, one must cease seeking parental authorization and assume the psychological burdens their predecessors can no longer sustain. Observe the shift in Ethan's personality matrix as he hardens into a ruthless operator. He states with flat effect that Emma is the operational core. Her autonomic nervous system spikes. She visibly freezes. Ethan details the behavioral trap. Because she represents the uncontrolled variable generating terror, they will simulate her fleeing the territory. In practice, she will function as an embedded psychological weapon. No operative will suspect a civilian of executing cognitive warfare, especially not a narcissist like Dom. Vincent issues a harsh verbal deterrent, anxious about utilizing a civilian proxy. However, narcissistic arrogance creates a profound cognitive blind spot. The moment you categorize an opponent as powerless based on their social origin, you unknowingly hand them the precise instrument required to dismantle your reality. Vincent forcefully demands the parameters of his son's tactical schema. Ethan maintains an emotional baseline of absolute 0. He outlines a controlled psychological stress test. They will fabricate an encounter between the traitor and the waitress. She will implant ambiguous verbal stimuli and allow Dom's clinical paranoia to construct the threat. His inevitable panic response will provide the empirical data required to authorize a strike. Ethan commends her cognitive flexibility, classifying her as highly proficient in mental warfare. Stick with me, because you and I are about to watch this psychological trap snap shut. The auditory void stretches to agonizing lengths. 15 seconds. 20. Emma uses rhythmic counting to regulate her anxiety. You rarely need to forcefully extract a confession. Provide a compromised subject with an isolated environment and sufficient tension, and their own guilt will execute them. The environment underscores the psychological burden compressing Emma's psyche. She is being pulled into the violent epicenter of a criminal collapse. Vincent's coarse vocal tone penetrates the atmosphere, establishing a firm boundary. He explicitly states she will not be coerced into this lethal behavioral experiment. He ensures Ethan registers this parameter, then probes Emma for her internal motivation. We study her micro-expressions as she closes her eyes, processing traumatic stimuli. She recalls the threatening cipher, the predatory vehicle in the dark, and the informant who orchestrated Ethan's near execution. Her snap open, her pupillary response, indicating pure resolve. Her moral framework cannot permit a 20-year betrayal to remain uncorrected. The most agonizing decisions occur when maintaining passive safety generates far more psychological agony than voluntarily stepping into an active incinerator. We observe Emma's effect closely. Her physiological tremors have ceased. She has systematically dismantled her victim complex. Her thoughts shift to her mother, a subject who existed under the suffocating weight of unexpressed regret. Emma consciously rejects that generational trauma. She demands the complete psychological profile on Dom. Vincent exhales, his stress markers dropping as she assumes control. Dom is 61, afflicted with narcissistic vanity, and suffers from the delusion that he is an apex judge of character. Ethan scoffs, confirming the traitor's lack of self-awareness. Vincent notes the target holds court at Carmine's every Thursday, 48 hours away. Ethan exhibits sudden panic, urging her to abort. But Emma stares into the void, completely devoid of fear markers. The most lethal subjects are never those forced into a defensive posture. They are the ones who voluntarily march straight into the inferno. Let us open this clinical file by examining the subject Emma. She categorically terminates the men's hesitation, instructing them to stop treating her like fragile glass. 12 years of conditioning in, alongside volatile subjects in cramped spaces, has fortified her baseline. Exposing a megalomaniacal narcissist is elementary for her. She weaponizes silence to establish her immense gravity. True influence never requires a raised decibel. She demands every data point on Domenico, isolating the exact triggers for his ego. Ethan and Vincent finally capitulate with a dark resolve. We must extract a vital lesson from this dynamic. The most devastating shifts in power almost always originate from the very individuals society has conditioned us to ignore entirely. The clock strikes rhythmically like a hammer. For Emma, this 48-hour window is a clinical study in traumatic anticipation. Time is a merciless stressor when a fatal collision approaches. Beneath the harsh fluorescent lighting of her Wednesday shift, she sterilizes tables, her micro-expressions locked into a flawless, hollow smile. She pours coffee for transient figures who fail to register her existence. But observe the rigid tension in her jaw. She is systematically weaponizing 12 years of absolute invisibility. You and I must analyze this behavior together to understand its truth. True power rarely announces itself with a grand display. Sometimes, the extraordinarily patient hands serving your morning brew are quietly orchestrating the total systemic collapse of a criminal empire. By day, Emma perfectly executes the behavioral markers of a terrified civilian fleeing shadows. Yet, under the solitary kitchen bulb, that artificial construct shatters. Notice her deep exhaustion as Ethan transmits the dark psychological anatomy of Domenico Ferraro over the phone. She clinically evaluates his monstrous ego and slow breathing like a pathologist examining diseased tissue. Domenico is a relic of archaic bloodlines, operating with a rusted caution. He is completely oblivious to the calculated threat creeping into his immediate proximity. There is a profound diagnostic lesson written directly into his psychological blind spot. The moment a man grows entirely too comfortable wearing a heavy crown, he permanently ceases checking the floorboards for a hidden trapdoor. Let us dissect this cognitive failure. Domenico maintains the delusion that his psychological assessment of any room is entirely infallible. He extracts narcissistic supply from the hushed reverence of elite dining spaces. Ethan correctly diagnoses that the man is suffocating beneath his own pathological vanity. Emma calculates exactly how to inhabit the role of the disposable female. She physically alters her posture, shaping her body into a form a megalomaniac will instantly dismiss. It is a terrifyingly accurate physical manipulation. The harshest truth of human survival is firmly isolated right here. Being deeply underestimated by a violent sociopath is the absolute greatest armor you can possibly wear. They never register the threat until the damage is irreversible. The audio reduces to Ethan's abrasive whisper. He directs her behavior like a desperate father, sending his child into a hostile environment. He instructs her to act as a mirror, purely reflecting Domenico's massive ego. Megalomaniacs will voluntarily hang themselves with their own dialogue to sustain the illusion of dominance. When his bloodline is referenced, Ethan urges her to simulate complete psychological fragmentation. Emma stares at the wall, noting that mimicking such agony requires zero theatrical effort. Silence swallows the connection as Ethan's hardened exterior collapses into raw grief. This exposes a profoundly clinical truth about the human condition. The deepest, most traumatic psychological scars we endure frequently forge the precise instruments we require to survive. Ethan's voice fractures into panic, pleading with her to abort if the variables shift. He uses Luca's name as a desperate psychological anchor. Emma simply closes her eyes, exhales heavily, and terminates the connection. The room plunges into absolute darkness. For 4 hours she actively suppresses her primitive flight response. We observe her sitting quietly on the mattress, systematically inviting the creeping dread to sit right beside her as dawn washes over her hollow features. We must remember this protocol when the walls close in. You can never successfully outrun the primal terror hunting you in the dark. The only effective strategy to survive an encroaching nightmare is to invite it inside, maintain direct eye contact, and flatly refuse to surrender your ground. We observe Emma calculating her tactical maneuvers. If the sociopath detects the anomaly, she simply extracts herself. But if the trap engages, Domenico's tragically fragile ego will organically manufacture his own destruction. We track her regulated respiratory rate, identifying a survivor who has navigated the wrath of violent males since her early developmental years. She intimately understands the highly predictable behavioral patterns of megalomaniacal arrogance. She possesses the cognitive stamina to endure one final interrogation. The core philosophy of psychological survival is evident here. True victory rarely belongs to the loudest narcissist shouting from a crumbling throne. It invariably belongs to the quiet observer who refuses to blink while an arrogant fool methodically burns his own kingdom to ash. Thursday arrives. Emma enters the establishment, her presentation meticulously engineered for this final behavioral experiment. The atmosphere is saturated with the weight of systemic corruption, yet she drifts toward the corner like a completely detached entity. She exhibits supreme impulse control, refusing to let her focus drift toward the concealed artillery in the periphery. Suddenly, the ambient acoustic frequency of the room drops. The apex predator enters the frame at exactly 1:05, draped in custom tailoring that radiates lethal pride. This sequence teaches a profound lesson regarding the confrontation of pure clinical evil. To successfully cage a ruthless sociopath, you must regulate your autonomic breathing and occupy the physical space, as though you exclusively own the killing floor. Domenico navigates the room like a pathological emperor, presiding over dependent subjects, absorbing the illusion of absolute divinity. Through Emma's hyper-vigilant lens, his grand performance degrades. He is simply an aging organism facade. The tension spikes the microsecond at Hoprokef, locks onto her sociopathic gaze, locks onto her solitary position. Regulating the temporal pacing flawlessly, she maintains her stare through the glass until the cognitive pressure peaks. Then she pivots, widening her pupils into a flawless simulation of prey vulnerability. The fatal cognitive deficit of apex predators is perfectly exposed right here. They become so severely intoxicated by their own perceived omnipotence that they completely fail to process the heavy steel jaws waiting directly beneath their own feet. Emma manufactures a psychological masterpiece with a frail contraction of her facial muscles. Simulating deep mourning, Domenico occupies the adjacent table, his massive enforcers framing the perimeter, Her peripheral input registers their lethal bulk, but her external physiology remains perfectly oblivious. His imposing shadow eclipses her light source. His voice slides across the table like an intoxicating poison, casually probing to see if she has been abandoned. He deploys a synthetic smile, engineered to disarm her defensive protocols. Emma exhales only her first name, projecting the flawless innocence of a doomed organism. The cruel clinical reality of human predation is completely inescapable here. The most comforting vocal tones frequently conceal the darkest sociopathic malice. You must never trust a predator openly smiling at his chosen meal. Modulating her voice to sound brittle, Emma whispers she is simply trapped in her own traumatic cognition. Domenico gestures to the vacant chair. We observe a calculated micro-expression of vulnerability before she gives a slow, submissive nod. Domenico occupies the seat, ordering a beverage in a flex of absolute territorial dominance. He leans into her boundary, wrapping his interrogation in synthetic empathy. He requires her to feel secure, but Emma is the unseen architect of this clinical trial. She feeds him a pitiful, monochromatic dataset about her existence, lamenting the exhaustion of diner shifts. Let us evaluate this brilliant cognitive deception together. The most impenetrable psychological armor is routinely forged from profoundly boring truths. Feed a megalomaniac a remarkably dull reality, and his predatory focus will instantly wander. The atmospheric density increases as Domenico listens with an unblinking, predatory intensity. Emma remains immobilized, beneath his assessment, allowing the silence to generate emotional friction. She exhales heavily, regarding a miserable week fully dissolving into the profile of a crushed spirit. Domenico beams with synthetic warmth, while the cold machinery behind his eyes rapidly categorizes her psychological vulnerabilities. The cognitive trap is finally armed. Emma lowers her focus to the rim of her beverage, clenching her jaw in a calculated display of suppressed terror. She whispers about unintentionally intersecting with terrifyingly powerful male figures. A brutal and highly necessary truth emerges within this clinical framework. Playing the role of the helpless fool is frequently the absolute deadliest blade you can cleanly slide between a sociopath's ribs. Today, you and I are going to examine a classic behavioral anomaly. Watch Dom's face. For one violent fraction of a second, his polished sociopathic mask completely fractures. Emma observes the hyper-vigilant flare in his pupils, a textbook manic response when a predator registers a sudden threat. He rapidly reconstructs his facade, offering hollow condolences to pacify her. But Emma applies acute psychological pressure, whispering that she harbors dangerous, unsolicited secrets. She is testing his neurological reaction to fear. 3 agonizing seconds of silence stretch across the table, exposing his fatal cognitive blind spot. He asks absolutely nothing about the nature of those secrets. An innocent mind desperately seeks data. A guilty one attempts to minimize exposure. The lesson here is simple but absolute. The specific questions a person actively refuses to ask will always serve as the clearest map to their darkest sins. Notice his defense mechanism. Rather than simulating normal human empathy, Dom deploys a ghastly, hollow smile and immediately redirects the psychological focus. He begins philosophizing about the talents of powerful men, consciously avoiding the behavioral trap Emma just set. He fails to ask about the identities. He completely ignores the dark secrets she mentioned. He maneuvers past the threat with the practiced evasion of a pathological survivor. Across the table, a chilling wave of cognitive clarity washes over Emma. The precise betrayal Ethan hypothesized is sitting right across from her. She meticulously maintains her own trembling facade for 20 agonizing minutes, This clinical reality forces a bleak life lesson. Once the cold, dead eyes of a predator are finally exposed, you can never unsee that horror, regardless of how flawlessly they paint their mask. Emma steps out of the restaurant, the acute stress response finally catching up with her nervous system. She had manipulated the dead air flawlessly, allowing Dom to fill the void to maintain his illusion of control. Now the adrenaline rapidly depletes, leaving her knees trembling on the cold concrete. Luca detaches from the flickering shadows. Exhibiting the flattened, affect typical of a seasoned enforcer, he barely moves his lips to deliver a crushing variable. He heard every single word. The syndicate covertly wired the room to capture empirical proof. Emma suppresses her primal escape impulse, forcing her shaking hands into her pockets. One simply does not engage a conditioned killer on the street. It teaches us a bitter truth about survival. Trust is an extraordinarily expensive currency, and paranoid men of power will always demand to verify it before they buy in. Step into this room with me, because the psychological tension is suffocating. Vincent paces the floorboards like a caged apex predator exhibiting severe psychomotor agitation. Ethan stands perfectly still against the wall, a bruised silhouette processing trauma. They have reviewed the audio evidence. Emma takes her seat with calculated slowness, allowing the silence to build before delivering the final data point. Dom did not ask a single question. Vincent abruptly stops pacing. A profound physiological agony washes over the aging megalomaniac as he realizes his oldest confidant completely failed the baseline test. Emma maintains eye contact with the grieving patriarch, offering clinical precision instead of mercy. Innocent subjects aggressively demand answers, but guilty ones deflect. Here is your brutal life lesson. Rapid deflection is always the loudest confession a guilty conscience can possibly manufacture. Emma refuses to break visual contact, anchoring the room to the fact that this psychological trap was Ethan's exact architecture. It was a highly calculated behavioral test, and Dom failed it spectacularly. The silence flooding the space acts as an environmental stressor. Emma remains perfectly still, observing decades of pathological loyalty chemically dissolve in Vincent's brain. She smartly refrains from pushing the shattered patriarch. She knows catastrophic cognitive dissonance must be physically processed before it can be verbalized. Across the shadows, Ethan meets her gaze, establishing a profound, silent neural connection. It highlights a beautiful reality of human existence. Sometimes, two fundamentally fractured individuals can start from opposite extremes, only to find themselves surviving the exact same fire, finally feeling completely understood. The clinical observation pauses as Vincent steps into the hallway. Through the cracked door, his voice drops to an absolute zero cadence, the unmistakable acoustic signature of a megalomaniac issuing a fatal directive. Inside, Ethan collapses into the armchair, his body sagging under the severe neurological toll of sustained survival mode. Emma leans forward, dropping her vocal register. She admits Ethan correctly predicted Dom's perceptual blindness toward her. She details the bitter emotional friction it caused, despite the fact that weaponizing her own social invisibility is precisely what kept her alive. This dynamic exposes a bleeding truth about our psychological wiring. Remaining utterly unseen provides a formidable tactical armor against a vicious environment. Yet the human ego still aches profoundly when you as if you simply do not exist, as if you simply do not exist. Let us look at this piece by piece, shall we? You can clinically observe the trauma of erasure in Emma's eyes as she describes Dom dismissing her existence. Ethan's defensive posture softens, gently questioning if she consciously engineered that cognitive blind spot into a tactical weapon. She nods to confessing the severe psychological deterioration caused by that survival mechanism. After 12 years of camouflaging her identity, she desperately wants to shed her ghost persona. Ethan offers a rare display of emotional vulnerability, promising her invisible days are over. When Vincent returns, the megalomaniacal kingpin vanishes for one fleeting second, replaced entirely by an exhausted father. It leaves us with a necessary life lesson. The painful psychological scars that force us to hide in the shadows never have to dictate the permanent shape of who we are. Observe the spatial dynamics as Vincent drops heavily into his chair. His tone mimics grinding stone as he firmly declares the Dom situation is handled. He provides zero operational details, a classic authoritarian tactic to terminate debate. Emma correctly interprets the environment cues, understanding this pathological environment well enough to remain entirely silent. Yet Ethan pushes the boundary, demanding data regarding Caruso. The tension spikes. Vincent deploys a terrifying, dominant glare that instantly neutralizes his son's defiance, explicitly forbidding further rogue behaviors. The suffocating weight of untreated generational trauma is palpable before Ethan finally breaks eye contact and submits. This standoff reveals a stark life lesson. Establishing rigid boundaries is often the only method we have to protect our sanity from the people who claim to love us the most. Notice how acute psychological trauma can rapidly rewrite decades of conditioning. In the dim light, the fractured relationship between a narcissistic patriarch and his alienated son experiences a sudden neurological reset. They waged war for years, but the sheer terror of recent events has forcibly bonded their trauma responses. Then, Vincent directs his heavy gaze toward Emma. He attempts to vocalize, but the formidable criminal architect actually falters. A man who spent decades manipulating human behavior is rendered functionally nonverbal. He whispers that he lacks the cognitive vocabulary to adequately process what she did in that alleyway. The psychological takeaway here is profoundly human, genuine. Life-altering gratitude rarely requires a polished sentence. It speaks the loudest in those vulnerable moments where our carefully crafted words completely fail us. Emma instinctively shifts her posture, displaying avoidance behavior to deflect the intense validation. Vincent raises a scarred hand, halting her withdrawal. Demonstrating a highly uncharacteristic emotional shift, he softly commands her to simply listen. He clinically outlines her terrifying reality. She walked completely blind into a structured criminal labyrinth, yet maintained her cognitive functions under suffocating stress. She extracted his air, maintained eye contact with apex predators, and successfully weaponized the social camouflage of an ignored woman. It is a textbook demonstration of latent resilience overriding impossible variables. This dark case file offers a crucial life lesson. We must never diagnose a person's quietness as fragility. The most profoundly overlooked individuals almost always harbor the most terrifying strength when survival demands it. Let us analyze this specific interaction together. Vincent intentionally dismantles his impenetrable narcissistic facade. Stripped of his authoritarian posturing, he establishes direct eye contact and formally logs an eternal psychological debt. Emma remains rigidly still. Internally, she is experiencing a mild trauma flashback, fleeing the violent limitations of her past. Overcoming the somatic response, she squares her shoulders, matches the megalomaniac's lethal gaze, and establishes her boundary. Once the acute violence concludes, she demands verifiable confirmation that the threat matrix is permanently deactivated. This quiet standoff perfectly illustrates a harsh truth about human neurobiology. Existing in a perpetual state of hypervigilance is merely biological survival. Actual freedom only begins the exact second you plant your feet and permanently refuse to keep running. Pay very close attention to the clinical gravity here. Emma sustains the unwavering stare of a severe antisocial personality, demanding he personally confirm when the retaliatory cycle terminates. She consciously rejects a future dictated by clinical paranoia. Vincent slowly nods. He offers a solemn commitment devoid of his usual manipulation, empirically proving that authentic trust holds far more behavioral influence than violence. Gathering her coat, Emma locks onto Ethan's gaze. He observes her with a radically tender affect, his massive defensive barriers completely dissolved. He softly murmurs he will see her next Thursday, his vocal tone leaking the profound psychological attachment he cannot yet vocalize. This illustrates a resonant truth about human connection. Genuine safety is never found behind loaded weapons. It is built entirely upon the fragile promises we actually choose to honor. You and I know how rare it is to find baseline stability after a severe psychological rupture. Ethan offers a dissociative smile through severe facial lacerations, making a quiet commitment to visit her diner. Emma observes him, noting the radical shift from the hemorrhaging victim she extracted from the alleyway days prior. She recognizes the chaotic variables that force their distinct behavioral profiles into collision. Softly agreeing to save him a booth, exiting into the chill of the evening, she enters a waiting vehicle. The urban grid operates around her, entirely detached from the profound neurological shock she survived. Yet, analyzing this case file leaves us with a fundamental truth. No matter how violently your internal reality fractures, the human mind will always seek a quiet space to process and heal. We observe the classic disorientation of a subject returning to a normal routine. Emma rests at the leather, processing the architecture of her former life through tinted glass. Her environment remains undisturbed by the extreme violence and betrayal she recently navigated. Yet, the reflection staring back presents a complete stranger. Acute trauma has drastically rewired her neural pathways, leaving her in hypervigilant uncertainty about her core identity. But within this clinical analysis, we uncover a critical mechanism of human survival. Enduring profound psychological ambiguity is not the same as being clinically lost. Sometimes, standing in the absolute darkest cognitive fog simply indicates you have finally reached the unfiltered starting line of your existence. The deadbolt engages with a sharp mechanical crack, isolating her from external stimuli. Emma stands in the suffocating quiet of her residence, illuminated by a harsh yellow glow. Her motor functions operate on pure autopilot as she moves into the shadowed kitchen. She collapses into a chair, her exhausted gaze locking onto her own pale hands. 48 hours prior, those exact palms were saturated with a stranger's lifeblood. Those fingers applied desperate pressure, fighting to sustain a failing biological system, while an apex predator commanded her to retreat. This behavioral case highlights a profound reality of our condition. We rarely comprehend the terrifying threshold of our own psychological resilience until an absolute, unavoidable crisis forces us to deploy it. Her posture in that alley defied every standard flight response. She locked eyes with a sociopathic kingpin and refused to submit to his dominance. Now, the hiss of the coffee maker grounds her in the present. Emma watches the dark liquid fill her mug, gripping the warm ceramic. We observe a fascinating physiological shift here. The chronic nervous tremors have ceased entirely. This apartment will never serve as a secure baseline again. Yet her paralytic anxiety has been eradicated. We are witnessing the ultimate paradox of trauma recovery. By engaging with extreme violence to pull a stranger from the brink, she inadvertently reconstructed her own psyche. Sometimes, actively anchoring another human being in the dark is the only way we manage to stabilize our own mind.